Subscribe now because this story will change how you see money forever. August 15th, 1971, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Every television in America flickered to life with an emergency broadcast. President Richard Nixon sat behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office, his face grave, his jaw set. Americans leaned forward in their living rooms, wondering what crisis had interrupted their Sunday evening programs. Was it war? Was it an assassination? Nixon began to speak, and what he said would change the world forever. He announced that the United States was closing the gold window. Most Americans had no idea what that meant, but by the time they woke up Monday morning, the entire global financial system had been rewritten. This wasn't just a policy change. It was the greatest wealth transfer in human history, $35 trillion, and almost nobody noticed it happening. Let me show you how they did it. To understand August 15th, 1971, we have to go back to 1944. World War II was still raging. Europe was destroyed, Asia was in flames, but American bankers and politicians were already planning the post-war world. In July 1944, 730 delegates from 44 countries gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. It was a massive resort in the White Mountains, isolated and secure. For 3 weeks, they designed a new global monetary system. The Bretton Woods Agreement established a simple rule. Every currency in the world would be pegged to the US dollar, and every US dollar would be backed by gold. The exchange rate was fixed at $35 per ounce of gold. If you had $35, you could exchange it for 1 ounce of gold from the US Treasury, no questions asked. This meant the dollar was as good as gold. It gave the dollar credibility and made it the world's reserve currency. Why did other countries agree to this? Because America had the gold? At the end of World War II, the United States held 20,000 tons of gold in Fort Knox and other depositories, roughly 70% of all the monetary gold in the world. America was the only major economy that hadn't been bombed to rubble. American factories were running at full capacity. The U.S. was producing half of the world's manufactured goods. America was the undisputed economic superpower, so the world accepted American dominance. For 25 years, the system worked. The dollar was trusted because it was backed by gold. International trade flourished. Europe rebuilt with American loans. Japan rose from the ashes. The global economy grew faster than ever before in history. But there was a problem brewing. It was getting bigger every year. The problem was simple. America was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. In the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. government was spending money like water. The Cold War was expensive. The arms race with the Soviet Union cost hundreds of billions. Building nuclear weapons, missiles, submarines, bombers, all of it required enormous funding. Then came Vietnam. By 1968, over 500,000 American troops were fighting in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The war was costing $25 billion a year, equivalent to $200 billion in today's money. But the spending didn't stop there. President Lyndon Johnson launched the Great Society programs. Medicare, Medicaid, the war on poverty, urban development, education reforms. These were ambitious social programs that cost tens of billions more. The government was spending far more than it was collecting in taxes. The budget deficit exploded. To cover the deficit, the Treasury printed more dollars. Here's where the problem became critical. Foreign countries, especially France and Germany, started to notice. They were receiving dollars for their exports to America. They were holding massive reserves of dollars. But they began to worry. Are there really enough gold bars in Fort Knox to back all these dollars? Or is America printing money it can't redeem? In 1965, French President Charles de Gaulle made a bold move. He was a proud nationalist who resented American financial dominance. He suspected the U.S. was inflating the dollar and cheating the system. So he sent the French Navy across the Atlantic. French warships docked in New York Harbor and loaded $150 million worth of gold from the Federal Reserve. They sailed back to France and deposited the gold in the Banque de France. De Gaulle publicly questioned the Bretton Woods system. He said the dollar's role as reserve currency gave America an exorbitant privilege. He called for a return to a pure gold standard where no country had special status. Other countries took note. If France could exchange dollars for gold, so could they. Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands all started converting dollars into gold. It became a slow-motion bank run. By 1971, the U.S. gold reserves had fallen from 20,000 tons to 8,100 tons. At the rate countries were redeeming dollars, Fort Knox would be empty within 2 years. President Nixon faced an impossible choice. He could raise interest rates and cut government spending to stop the dollar outflow, but that would cause a recession and cost him the 1972 election. Or he could defend the dollar's gold peg by continuing to ship gold overseas until the vaults were empty. Neither option was acceptable. So he chose a third option. He decided to cheat. He would change the rules of the game. On the weekend of August 13th, 1971, Nixon secretly gathered his top economic advisors at Camp David. the presidential retreat in the mountains of Maryland, Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, Budget Director George Shultz, Economic Advisor Paul Volcker. They debated through the night. Some advisors warned that abandoning the gold standard would destroy the dollar's credibility. Others argued it was the only way to preserve American power. Nixon made his decision. On Sunday evening, he would go on television and announce that the United States was closing the gold window. Foreign governments could no longer exchange dollars for gold. The Bretton Woods system was dead. At 9 p.m. on August 15th, Nixon addressed the nation. He framed it as a defense against currency speculators and a protection for American workers. He imposed a 90-day wage and price freeze to control inflation. He slapped a 10% tariff on all imports to protect American jobs. But buried in the middle of his speech was the bombshell. He announced that the U.S. would no longer convert dollars to gold. He said it was temporary, a suspension, not an end. But everyone who understood finance knew the truth. This was permanent. The dollar was now a fiat currency, backed by nothing but the government's promise. The next morning, global markets went into shock. Currency trading was frozen. Stock markets plunged. Central banks didn't know what to do. The value of every dollar, every bond, every bank account was suddenly uncertain. The Germans called it a betrayal. The French called it economic warfare. The British called it the end of an era. For 2 years, finance ministers tried to negotiate a new system. They met in Washington, in Rome, in Paris. They tried to create new rules, new exchange rates, new mechanisms. But it was all theater. The reality was clear. America would not go back to gold. The dollar would float free, and the world would have to accept it. Why did the world accept it? Because there was no alternative. The U.S. economy was still the largest. The U.S. military was the strongest. American companies dominated global trade. If you wanted to buy oil, you needed dollars. If you wanted to trade internationally, you needed dollars. The dollar remained the world's reserve currency, not because it was backed by gold, but because America was too powerful to defy. But Nixon's move did something else, something even more profitable. It set the stage for the petrodollar system. In 1973, just 2 years after the gold window closed, the Arab oil producers launched an embargo. Oil prices quadrupled overnight. The world economy plunged into crisis, but Nixon's team saw an opportunity. Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Saudi Arabia in 1974 with a secret proposal. The deal was simple. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil only in U.S. dollars. In exchange, the United States would provide military protection, weapons, and guaranteed security for the Saudi royal family. The Saudis agreed. Other OPEC countries followed. Oil, the most essential commodity on earth, could now only be purchased with dollars. This created artificial demand for dollars. Every country needed dollars to buy energy. They had to hold dollar reserves. They had to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. This meant the U.S. could print as many dollars as it wanted, and the world would absorb them by buying oil. It was economic genius. America could run endless deficits, fight endless wars, spend beyond its means, and export the inflation to the rest of the world. The wealth transfer was staggering. Between 1971 and today, the U.S. has accumulated $35 trillion in national debt. That's money printed out of thin air, backed by nothing but the petrodollar system and military power. American consumers bought goods from around the world with paper dollars. Other countries accepted those dollars because they needed them for oil. They recycled the dollars by buying U.S. government bonds, which funded more American spending. It was a perpetual cycle of wealth extraction. Let me put this in perspective. Before 1971, if America wanted to spend money, it had to tax its citizens or sell bonds backed by gold reserves. After 1971, America could simply print money. The rest of the world absorbed the inflation because they were trapped in the dollar system. American living standards rose, while other countries paid the hidden cost through currency devaluation. Europe's currencies weakened. Latin America suffered hyperinflation. Asian economies were forced to peg their currencies to the dollar to survive. The American middle class enjoyed cheap imported goods. Walmart, Amazon, the entire consumer economy was built on the ability to print dollars and buy foreign products without giving real value in return. Houses, stocks, everything inflated in dollar terms because the money supply exploded. But wages stagnated because the inflation was exported abroad. The top 1% got richer because they owned assets that inflated with the money supply. The bottom 50% struggled because their wages didn't keep pace. This is why inequality exploded after 1971. The gold standard had enforced fiscal discipline. Governments couldn't print unlimited money because they needed gold to back it. After 1971, the only limit was what the market would accept. And the market accepted a lot because the petrodollar system forced it to. Today, every American benefits from this system, whether they know it or not. You pay less for electronics, clothes, cars, because those dollars buy foreign labor cheaply. You get cheap mortgages because foreign central banks buy U.S. bonds. But you also pay the price. Your savings lose value every year. Your paycheck buys less. Your children inherit a $35 trillion debt that can never be repaid. And now the system is starting to crack. China and Russia are trading oil in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia is considering selling oil in other currencies. The BRICS nations are building alternative payment systems. The rest of the world is tired of subsidizing American spending. When the petrodollar system finally collapses, and it will, the American standard of living will plunge. The imported goods will become expensive. The government debt will become unpayable. The dollar will lose its reserve status. And Americans will finally pay the bill for 50 years of printing money backed by nothing. August 15th, 1971, was the day America became the ultimate con artist. Nixon sold the world a currency backed by nothing and convinced everyone it was valuable. For 50 years, it worked. But nothing lasts forever. The gold is gone. The trust is gone. The only thing backing the dollar now is the memory of when it used to be backed by something real. Subscribe now to understand the system before it collapses. Because when you see how money really works, you stop being a victim and start preparing for what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button because the next crisis will make 2008 look like a practice run.